Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take source material you're interested in, and, well, we help you untack the most interesting bits.
Exactly.
This one's tailored just for you, and today we're diving into a really fascinating stack. It's a collection of reviews, literary notes. Gives us a real window into the critical scene back in the late 19th century.
Yeah, mostly the 1880s, 1890s, that kind of period.
Right.
And the material covers quite a bit. Literature, sure, but also art, drama, even glimpses of society, all through the eyes of, the critics and commentators of that time.
So our mission here is to navigate this stuff together. We want to pull out the really striking observations, the critical angles that maybe surprise you, and those little details that give you that aha moment.
Without getting totally bogged down in jargon.
Definitely. We want you to feel like you get it, like you were there almost, understanding what these critics were actually thinking about, what debates were hot then.
It's like we're looking over their shoulder, trying to figure out what they valued, what they just dismissed.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, let's get into it. One of the first things the material points out is that these reviews, well, they weren't exactly striving for cool objectivity, were they?
Oh, not at all. It's made quite clear that many critiques were very personal, some openly biased, either really hostile or super friendly.
Right. And others described as being in the author's wittiest and happiest vein.
Which tells you something right there. Only a few were apparently truly colorless.
That's such a great point to start with.
Yeah.
It tells you right away you're not dealing with dry academic takes here. This is commentary with personality, often driven by the individual critic.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how even critical judgments are tied to a person, a voice, a moment.
The material even floats this idea about Oscar Wilde based on continental views at the time, mind you suggesting he was seen as a bigger deal than even his supporters realized.
Which is interesting because this was apparently before some of his most famous stuff came out.
Right, a snapshot of a reputation sort of building.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how these critiques keep circling back to themes that honestly still feel relevant. Like, there is this whole discussion about heredity in literature.
Heredity.
Yeah.
Like applying Darwinian ideas to novels.
Kind of, yeah. They mention authors like Dr. Holmes or Zola and his massive family saga, The Rougon McCourt.
Ah, okay.
And the source presents this idea, hereditary influence, almost like it's a scientific law shaping the literature of the century.
Wow.
It's pretty striking how those scientific ideas were filtering directly into how people analyzed books.
Thinking about fictional characters through the lens of inherited traits.
Yeah.
That's definitely a different perspective.
Right.
Okay, so shifting from novels for a second to the stage. Drama. They tackle a debate that feels really familiar. Are Shakespeare's plays better read in your study or actually seen performed?
And the view in these sources, pretty firm. They strongly disagree with the just read it idea. Yeah, the argument is clear. Shakespeare wrote for performance, changing his form. Big mistake. The beauty, they say, is only really conveyed properly through the actor's skill. There's even a nice little anecdote about seeing a production, I think it was in Oxford, where the critic felt the lines gain new music and the heroism felt more real thanks to the actors.
That's powerful. And they even get into the practicalities, like stagecraft.
They do, mentioning Shakespeare's clumsy methods like using signs or descriptions instead of actual scenery.
Right.
Whereas the modern approach, using scenery that explains itself, is seen as better. It lets the audience connect more directly.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I thought.
Yeah.
They argue that this kind of scenery helps create an artistic temperament in the audience. It produces joy and beauty for beauty's sake.
Right. And that aesthetic appreciation is seen as absolutely essential for getting great art. They pretty much dismiss anyone who says scenery hides the play's passion as talking nonsense, uttering a foolish preface.
So the whole package, acting, scenery, the physical production, was vital for triggering that aesthetic response in the audience. That's a strong stance on how stagecraft works.
It really is.
What about moving between forms, like adapting novels into plays?
Yeah, that's seen as, well, questionable. The source suggests you lose crucial things, like deep psychological analysis, maybe?
Yeah.
And it specifically notes that Zola's Formule Scientifique, his whole scientific method thing for novels, gains nothing on stage.
So it highlights the differences between mediums.
Exactly. Their unique strengths, their limits. And you also get critiques of specific shows praising things like, say, the chorus movements in A Greek Day, but also noting that acting sincerity is more about tone and presence than just shouting.
Right, not just volume. Okay, back to literature then. Novels again. These sources offer some pretty pointed critiques.
Definitely. Some works get praise, like one called Joyce, the Little Puritan Maiden, for having high purpose and noble meaning, but crucially, never being dull.
That's key, is it? Not being dull.
Always. But others get slammed for bad writing style. Phrases called not very pleasing English, or even
Quite detestable. Ouch.
yeah. And there's a sort of wry comment that a lot of modern novels seemed more focused on crime than on culture. And a critique of a novel that sticks to one single point of view for 3 whole volumes. The critic says the permanent ego in fiction soon becomes a bore.
You know, that still resonates. The idea that one perspective can just get tedious.
Totally. Life should be approached from lots of angles in fiction, this critic felt.
And the critique extends pretty sharply to translation, too.
Oh, does it ever? There's a really scathing take on some Balzac translations.
What did they say?
Claiming the translators just do not understand French. And that some phrases were basically an insult to 2 languages.
Wow, brutal. That really hammers home how important and how difficult they saw good literary translation, especially for someone like Balzac.
For sure. The sources also touch on poetry, translations like modern Greek lyrics.
Right, where they note some beauty might survive the transfer, like pouring wine from golden into silver cup. A nice image.
It is! And then critiques of contemporary English poets, which are wonderfully specific.
Like what?
Well, one poet gets called out for writing about Rude Boreas, the north wind.
Ah, the classical reference.
Yeah, and the critic basically says you might as well just call Dawn Aurora. It's a jab at overly stuffy, artificial language.
Got it.
And another critique calls misprints in the poet Herrick's work unpardonable. Declares a poet can survive everything but a misprint.
That's fantastic. A misprint as the ultimate sin for a poet. Love that detail.
Me too. And then there's the observation about Mr. Austen writing formal poems, rondeaus on ribbons, and lyrics on lace.
Finding inspiration in fashion.
Apparently.
Oh.
Even Balmoral boots.
Poetry about boots and lace. It really gives you a feel for the range of stuff critics were dealing with, and maybe, rolling their eyes at sometimes.
Definitely. There's also talk about poetry taking on new themes, like socialism or sympathy for the poor, suggesting these could be nobler and loftier themes. But it's noted that attempts to actually put socialist ideas into poetry were often the least successful.
Ah, the message overwhelming the art, maybe?
Perhaps. That tension between form and ideology. There's even this slightly sarcastic comment that if a revolution happened in England, the socialists would probably produce pleasant glees and graceful part songs instead of an inarticulate roar.
A very civilized revolution they imagine there. What about using dialect in poetry?
Seen as a mixed bag, sometimes artificial, like you need a glossary again, but also potentially able to revive an antique spirit, allow for new rhymes, though trying to base a whole romantic movement on words like grumly, which means murky, was viewed skeptically.
So a debate about authenticity versus playing with language.
Pretty much, and the comments on Australian poets like Adam Lindsay Gordon are quite telling too. The source notes his style borrows heavily from Swinburnian stanzas, but finds an entire want of originality.
Harsh.
Yeah, though the critic kind of excuses it, saying youth is rarely original. But the real kicker is the comment that Gordon only got really popular after winning a horse race. A steeplechase.
No way.
Yep. Leading to the thought that maybe steering a horse well was seen as a bigger achievement than writing poetry, at least in some circles.
Wow. That's a pretty biting commentary on public taste and what gets celebrated.
Isn't it? Okay, so moving beyond literature and drama, the sources also get into art and aesthetics. There's this discussion pitting art against nature.
Ah, the classic debate. What's the take here?
Well, one view presented is that nature is, well, it's for metaphysics, for thinking about deeper truths. But art deals with appearances.
Okay.
And for the artists, their personal vision, their mood, that's considered more important than just copying the subject. They quote Corot saying, a landscape is just the mood of a man's mind.
So really emphasizing the artist's subjectivity. The painting is more about the artist's feeling than the thing itself.
Exactly. And we see specific critiques, too. Comparing Holbein's portraits unfavorably to the sham series of Scottish kings at Holyrood.
That feels like a deep cut, a very specific, slightly odd comparison.
It does. Meanwhile, Gustave Doré gets praised for his imagination, especially with the gloomy and the terrible. He's even called the Carlyle of artists.
That's a serious comparison. Carlyle.
Wow. I know. And then there's this discussion by Mr. Collier about common sense in art, which includes some wonderfully practical, almost funny advice for portrait painters.
Oh, I need to hear this.
Okay, so he advises consulting the sitter's relatives about the pose, the costume, the expression.
The relatives, not the sitter.
The relatives, why? Because, quote, it is they who have to live with the picture.
That's brilliant. It just flips the whole thing. Forget artistic vision. Forget maybe even what the sitter wants.
Yeah.
It's about keeping the family happy.
It's so client-focused, almost anti-artistic in a way. It really highlights that tension, doesn't it? Between art as personal expression and art as having a social or familial job to do.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And speaking of different views on art's purpose,
Yeah.
the material criticizes the Philistine.
Yeah. Yes, the Philistine.
As someone who confuses art and life. Like maybe getting morally outraged at fictional characters or just hating beauty itself.
Which brings us back to that idea of joy and beauty for beauty's sake we talked about with the stagecraft.
Mm-hmm. The decorative arts get a look in, too, noting the huge influence of Oriental design on European decorative stuff.
Yeah, mentioning specific things like tapisserie Chinois, Saracen carpets, and linking it back to historical events like the Crusades shows a real awareness of that global artistic exchange.
And lace making is discussed. It's relatively modern compared to embroidery, the source says.
Right, and it emphasizes that historically the patterns weren't usually designed by the lace maker. They were done by decorative artists who understood composition materials.
Ah, so a separation of design and execution.
Yeah, though apparently there was a feeling at the time that the maker should be the designer. And efforts to improve Irish lace designs get a mention too.
It's fascinating how they dive into both the big artistic ideas and these, practical, almost craft-based debates.
It really is. The material also gives us insights into how lives were written about through biographies.
Yes, like the critique of a Dickens biography. For just sticking to popular views and cheap criticisms.
And suggesting Dickens' characters are kind of flat, like from a fashion book or third-rate players, especially compared to Shakespeare's. Oof.
Double ouch.
And there's a note about Rossetti's biography being unsatisfactory because someone else, rude hands, got to the subject before the preferred biographer could.
Implying a sort of gatekeeping around artistic legacies.
Yeah.
Who gets to tell the official story?
Seems like it. But there's also this really delightful portrait of Hannah More.
Okay, tell me about Hannah More.
She's described as just this brilliant wit, a real femme d'esprit who loved society, charmed all the big literary figures, Johnson, Burke, Garrick,
Wow.
and sometimes got so enthusiastic she even broke the rules of good breeding. Just paints a really vivid picture of this charismatic woman in literary circles.
These sources are full of those kinds of specific, sometimes quite quirky descriptions, aren't they?
They really are. Like Richardson looking like a plump white mouse in a wig.
Or Pope compared to a spider or a small windmill.
They definitely had a way with words, and that anecdote about Wordsworth, told by someone local in the Lake District, it's so humanizing.
What did the local person say?
Described Wordsworth as ugly-faced. Didn't have the usual habits like smoking a pipe or drinking, but he was a great skater, could apparently cut his name on the ice.
That's wonderful. Such a grounded, real-worldy tale. Totally different from the image of the, lofty poet wandering lonely as a cloud.
Exactly. It really brings these historical figures down to earth in an unexpected way.
Okay, so beyond the arts, these sources also touch on some broader societal views, particularly around women, their position, education.
Yeah, there's some strong criticism presented about how lacking women's education was, seen as limiting them to just, stitch and sew or make baubles.
And calls for better education.
Definitely. Even suggesting specific colleges should be set up for women. And the discussion goes into women entering traditionally male fields, like being shopkeepers, acknowledging the prejudice against it then.
Right.
And there's even a debate about women in politics, referencing Herbert Spencer's worry that they'd bring the ethics of the family into the state.
What was the concern there? That they'd be too focused on personal relationships over abstract principles.
That seems to be the gist, yeah. Prioritizing domestic stuff over what was needed for governing. It's a very specific fear from that time.
How is that challenged in the sources?
Well, the counter-argument suggests that having separate virtues for men and women actually makes society weaker. And there's even a slightly funny suggestion that women physically capable of military service should absolutely get a vote, maybe to counter some objections. It just shows it was a time of really intense debate about gender roles.
Clearly a moment when lots of social norms were being questioned. The material also includes views on Ireland, Irish society, politics,
including critiques of a novel by a Mr. Froude, which is seen as pushing outdated ideas about Irish character. The critic basically says the Ireland Froude describes has disappeared.
So calling out stereotypes as being out of touch.
Exactly. And there's this quite provocative idea presented that the Celtic intellect needed to go across the Atlantic to America, perhaps, to really mature its power.
Learn some strength.
And England's weakness is how it's put. It's a pretty pointed comment about national identity and cultural development as perceived then.
What really stands out looking across all this is how the criticism wasn't just about whether a painting was good or a book was well written in isolation.
No, not at all.
It was constantly tangled up with debates about morality, about social class, national identity, gender, politics.
Absolutely. These sources are such a powerful reminder that all criticism comes from a specific time and place. It reflects the bigger picture, the concerns, the biases of that era.
We've covered a huge range, haven't we? From like specific writing techniques and stage design
To debates about realism versus personality in art, the influence of design from other parts of the world.
your shifting views on society, all seen through the unique lens of these commentators from the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Looking back at these perspectives, it really makes you think about how we critique things today. Art, literature, film. What are our blind spots? What debates are we having now that might seem really strange or maybe really insightful to someone looking back in 100 years?
It definitely makes you reflect. We saw glimpses in this material of debates that just keep going, don't they? Like the relationship between art and life. Should art try to be moral? How much does the artist's personality matter?
Exactly. So after hearing these viewpoints from the past, some arguing art needs a moral compass, others saying beauty is enough, some thinking personality is key, others valuing impersonality.
Yeah.
How do you think about that connection between an artist's life and their work?
Or whether art should aim to teach us something, make us better people, or just be beautiful.
Right. It's a debate these critics were deep in, and honestly, it feels like one we're still very much grappling with today.